The incident report began with a detail investigators couldn't explain. The body found at a remote reservoir was wearing a full wetsuit. The location was known for dangerous conditions where people rarely entered the water at all. There was no identification, no belongings, no footprints, no vehicle tracks, nothing on the shore that explained how he got there. And despite being in the water for weeks, everything about the scene suggested one thing: this wasn't an accident. The body had already started to come apart by the time Daniel Hargreaves saw it drifting near the edge of the reservoir, turning slowly in the water as if it had been waiting for someone to notice. He had been walking the same path he always took, a quiet stretch of land that curved along the hills where the wind never really stopped. It was the kind of place people avoided unless they knew it well. No shops, no houses, no reason to be there. Just water, stone, and long empty silence. At first, he thought it was debris, something caught in the shallows. But the shape didn't move like wood or plastic. It shifted with weight, with intention. Almost. By the time he stepped closer, he had already realized it was a person. The call went out within minutes. Local authorities arrived quickly, though not quickly enough to change anything. By the time they pulled the body from the water, there was very little left that could be recognized. What stood out wasn't the condition. It was the lack of everything else. The man was wearing only a wetsuit. No shoes, no bag, no watch, no keys, nothing that suggested he had arrived there like a normal person. The wetsuit itself was clean in a way that didn't match the surroundings. It hadn't been torn or damaged. It looked like it had been worn deliberately, for a reason. That was the first detail that made the case feel wrong. The second came later. Elias Mercer was assigned to the case within the first week. He wasn't the type to rush conclusions. He had worked long enough to know that the strangest cases were usually the simplest ones wearing the wrong shape. At least, that was what he believed at the start. The initial assumption was straightforward. Someone had gone into the water and never come back out. It happened more often than people realized. Cold water could shut the body down in minutes. The reservoir was known for that. Deep, still, and dangerously quiet. But as the days passed, that explanation began to collapse under its own weight. There were no reports of a missing swimmer. No one had seen a vehicle nearby. Search teams covered the entire perimeter, walking for hours along the edges, scanning for footprints, clothing, anything that might connect the man to the outside world. They found nothing. It was as if he had appeared in the water without ever touching the land around it. Elias spent most of his time going through the smaller details, the kind people overlooked when they were focused on bigger questions. The wetsuit was one of them. It was an extra large size, consistent with a tall, heavier build. That matched the body, but it didn't explain how the man had gotten it, or why he had worn it to a place where swimming was not just uncommon, but actively discouraged. The nearest road was too far for someone to walk unnoticed, especially carrying anything. And yet there were no signs of transport. No tire marks, no discarded belongings. It wasn't just that the man had died there. It was that he had arrived there without leaving behind a single trace of how. Weeks passed, then months. The body was examined repeatedly. Dental records were analyzed. DNA was run through every available database. Each time, the result came back the same. No match. That was when the case shifted from unusual to something else entirely. Because most people, even those who try to disappear, leave something behind. A record, a trace, a connection. This man had none. Elias started reviewing missing persons reports from surrounding regions, then from across the country. Eventually, from outside it, the list grew longer, but nothing aligned. No one matched the physical description closely enough. No timelines fit. At some point, the investigation stopped feeling like a search. It started feeling like a reconstruction of someone who had never officially existed. The facial reconstruction came later, nearly a year after the body was found. Specialists built the face slowly, layer by layer, using what remained of the skull. Muscles were added digitally, skin shaped around bone, features estimated from structure and proportion. When the final image was completed, it didn't look like a stranger. That was the unsettling part. Elias had seen hundreds of faces in his career, but this one carried something familiar, not in a way he could explain, just enough to make him pause longer than he should have. The man had a rounded face, slightly uneven teeth, a noticeable overbite. His expression, even in reconstruction, seemed fixed somewhere between neutral and aware. Like someone caught mid-thought, the image was released publicly. For a while, there was movement. People came forward with suggestions, possible identifications, vague similarities. Each lead was followed carefully. Each one ended the same way. Wrong person, wrong timeline, wrong life. The case began to quiet down again. Fewer calls, fewer reports, less interest. But Elias didn't let it go. He went back to the beginning. Not the body, not the search, the place. There was something about the reservoir that had been overlooked. Not in a supernatural sense. Nothing dramatic like that. Just a pattern that didn't fit. He reviewed weather reports from the estimated time the body had entered the water. Wind direction, temperature shifts, water levels. That was when he noticed it. The currents. The reservoir wasn't as still as it appeared. Under the surface, there were slow-moving flows, subtle but consistent. Strong enough to carry objects across distances without disturbing the surface too much. Strong enough to move a body. The location where Daniel had found the man wasn't where the man had entered the water. That changed everything. Elias mapped the possible entry points based on current patterns. There were only a few places where the body could have originated. Narrow areas along the far side, harder to access, even more isolated. Search teams had passed through those areas before, but they had been looking for belongings, not for signs of entry. When they returned with a different focus, they found something. Not immediately. It took time, careful inspection, a small indentation near the water's edge. Subtle, easy to miss, like something heavy had been placed there briefly, then removed. Nearby, partially hidden under loose soil and stone, there were faint impressions. Not footprints exactly, more like dragged weight, something being moved with effort, then lifted. There were no clear marks of a struggle, no signs of panic, just controlled movement, deliberate placement. That was when the final explanation began to take shape. The man had not walked into the reservoir. He had been brought there. The lack of belongings made sense now. They had never been there to begin with. Whoever had moved him had removed everything that could identify him. The wetsuit wasn't for swimming. It was for concealment. It preserved the body longer, delayed decomposition in a way that made identification harder, not easier. Whoever had done this understood that. The currents carried the body away from the entry point, placing it somewhere that felt random. Unconnected, isolated. It had worked. For over a year, the man remained unidentified. But the most disturbing part came after the reconstruction was circulated again, this time internally. Elias revisited older case files. Not missing persons, unclaimed bodies, cases where individuals had been found, processed, and buried without identification. There was one file that stood out. A man discovered months before the reservoir case. Different location, different circumstances, but similar physical features, same approximate age, same dental irregularities. At the time, the body had been too damaged for a full reconstruction. It had been logged, documented, and eventually buried under an unknown designation. Elias compared the data. The height matched, the jaw structure aligned, the dental pattern was nearly identical. It wasn't a second victim. It was the same man, which meant something else entirely. The man had been found once before, and then found again. The conclusion forced itself into place, piece by piece, until there was no other version left that made sense. Someone had accessed the original body, removed it after it had already been processed, transported it, redressed it, and placed it into the reservoir to be found again under different circumstances. Not to hide the death, but to erase the identity, because once a body is processed and buried, it becomes part of a system. Records, files, references, but if it reappears somewhere else, detached from that system, those connections break. The man in the reservoir wasn't just unidentified. He had been deliberately made unidentifiable. And the worst part was what that implied. Whoever had done it didn't just want him gone. They wanted him to stop existing in any official sense. No name, no history, no trace that he had ever belonged anywhere. By the time Elias closed the file, the face from the reconstruction no longer felt familiar in the same way. It felt empty, not because it lacked identity, but because someone had taken the time to remove it completely, and done it well enough that, even now, the only version of that man that still existed was the one nobody could recognize.